What would you do if you looked out into the endless dark of space and something looked back? Most of us will never know that feeling. The weightlessness, the silence, the profound isolation of being suspended in the void. But for the astronauts who have ventured beyond Earth, space is not always the empty darkness we imagine. Sometimes it reveals things that should not be there, things that defy explanation, things that linger in memory long after the mission ends. Tonight, we are going to explore the strangest things astronauts have seen. Not equipment malfunctions or technical glitches, but encounters that left trained scientists and engineers questioning everything they thought they knew. Faces appearing at windows where no face should exist. Lights that pulse and breathe like living creatures. Sounds that echo through the vacuum where sound cannot travel. These are not ghost stories. They are testimonies from people who dedicated their lives to logic, reason, and measurable truth. And yet, out there in the cosmic dark, they witness things that cannot be easily explained. Space is vast beyond comprehension. It is ancient, mysterious, and indifferent to our understanding. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between Earth and the stars, it shows us glimpses of something more, something we are not yet ready to understand, something that watches from just beyond the edge of our perception. So settle in. Let your mind drift. Let the strangeness of the cosmos carry you into the night. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, please take a moment to like and subscribe so you never miss a story. And now, let the stars guide you deeper into the mystery. Welcome to Sleepy Science Stories. Let us start at number 10, The Face Outside the Window. Discovery was one of NASA's workhorses, a spacecraft that had flown many missions and would fly many more. It was reliable, well-tested, and safe. The crew trusted it completely. They had flown on it before. They knew every system, every control, every quirk of its behavior. The shuttle moved at 17,000 miles per hour, circling the planet once every 90 minutes. But inside, everything felt still, motionless. The only sound was the soft hum of life support systems, the gentle whisper of air circulation, and the occasional creak of metal expanding and contracting as the shuttle moved from sunlight into shadow. These sounds become familiar to astronauts. They learn to recognize each one. The hum of the air circulation tells them the system is working. The creak of metal tells them they are moving from light to shadow or shadow to light. These sounds are normal, expected, comforting even. But astronaut Charles Walker was still awake. He had always found it difficult to sleep in space. The silence was too deep, too heavy. And so he floated near one of the windows, gazing out into the blackness, watching the faint glow of Earth as it turned slowly beneath him. Walker was not a career astronaut. He was a payload specialist, an engineer who had designed experiments for the shuttle missions. This was his second flight into space, and he thought he had grown accustomed to the strangeness of it all, the weightlessness, the view, the profound isolation. But space has a way of surprising you. Just when you think you understand it, it shows you something new. His first flight had been routine. He had conducted his experiments, marveled at the view, and returned home without incident. He thought he knew what to expect on this second mission. He thought space held no more surprises for him. He was wrong. Space has a way of making you feel small. It reminds you that you are just a tiny spark of life, suspended in an ocean of nothing. Walker had grown used to that feeling. He had learned to find peace in it. But on this particular night, something was different. The feeling started before he even looked out the window. A sense of unease, a prickling at the back of his neck, the kind of feeling you get when someone is watching you, even though you know you are alone. Walker tried to ignore it. He told himself he was being silly, but the feeling persisted. The earth below glowed softly, its blue oceans and white clouds visible even in the darkness. The sun had set on the planet beneath him, but the atmosphere still caught the light, creating a thin, luminous band of blue and green that separated the earth from the infinite black above. Walker found himself staring into that blackness, into the void. There were no stars visible from this angle, no moon, no distant planets, just pure, unbroken darkness. It was the kind of darkness that feels alive, the kind that presses against you, the kind that makes you wonder what might be looking back. As he looked out through the window, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. There, in the void beyond the glass, was a face. Not just a shadow, not just a reflection, a face. It was staring back at him. Walker froze. His heart began to beat faster. He did not move. He simply stared, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The face was faint, barely visible, but it was there. It had features, eyes, a mouth. The soft glow of Earth's atmosphere illuminated it from below, casting gentle light across its shape. It looked almost human, almost. The proportions were slightly off, as if someone had tried to recreate a human face from memory but had gotten the details just a little bit wrong. The eyes were too large, or perhaps too far apart. The mouth seemed fixed in an expression that was neither smile nor frown, just neutral, observing. The uncanny valley, that is what scientists call it. When something looks almost human, but not quite, it triggers a deep sense of unease in us. Our brains recognize it as human-like, but also recognize that something is wrong. It is the same feeling you get looking at a realistic robot or a computer-generated face. Something is off, and it disturbs us on a fundamental level. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a reflection of something inside the cabin, a piece of equipment catching the light in an unusual way. But he looked around. There was nothing behind him that could create such an image, and the face was not on the glass. It was beyond it, out there, in space. Walker knew the shuttle inside and out. He knew where every piece of equipment was located. He knew how light moved through the cabin. He had spent weeks training in mock-ups of the spacecraft, and he knew with absolute certainty that there was nothing inside that could create this reflection. He considered waking the other crew members, but what would he say? How would he explain this? Would they believe him? Or would they think the isolation was getting to him? Would they question his fitness for the mission? For several long seconds, Walker simply stared. He did not call out to the crew. He did not reach for the radio. He just watched, his pulse pounding in his ears. And then, slowly, after what felt like an eternity, the face began to fade. It dissolved into the darkness, as if it had never been there at all. The darkness swallowed it, piece by piece. First the mouth disappeared, then the nose, then finally the eyes, which seemed to linger the longest, staring at him until they too faded into nothing. Those eyes. Walker would remember them for the rest of his life. Not angry, not threatening, just watching, as if they were curious, as if they wanted to understand him, as if they were asking a question he could not hear. Walker floated there for a long time afterward, his mind spinning. He later wrote in his journal that the encounter left him shaken in a way he had never experienced before. It was not fear exactly. It was something deeper. A feeling that he had seen something he was never meant to see. In his journal, written in the cramped, floating cabin of discovery, Walker tried to capture the feeling. It was not like seeing a ghost, he wrote. It was like seeing through a crack in reality, like glimpsing something that exists in a space parallel to our own, something that is always there, just beyond our ability to perceive. And for one moment, the veil lifted. He tried to sleep, but could not. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face again, calm, watching, waiting. The hours until dawn were the longest of Walker's life. He floated by the window, occasionally glancing out, half hoping and half dreading that the face would return. He thought about everything he knew about space, about physics, about the human mind. He searched for an explanation, but he found none that satisfied him. The commander, a veteran astronaut with multiple flights under his belt, clapped Walker on the shoulder. "Space plays tricks," he said. "I once thought I saw my daughter waving at me from a cloud. Your brain does funny things up here. It misses familiar things. Home, people. It tries to find them in the darkness. The human brain," they reminded him, "is designed to see patterns. It searches for faces in everything. It is an evolutionary survival mechanism. We look for eyes watching us, even when there are none." Walker knew all this. He understood the science. But understanding did not change what he had seen. But Walker did not accept those explanations. He knew what a reflection looked like. He knew the difference between shadow and substance. And this, he insisted, was neither. He said he knew what he had seen. It was a face, and it was looking at him. "I am an engineer," Walker said later. "I deal with facts, with measurements, with things I can test and verify. I am not a person who sees ghosts or believes in the supernatural, but I know what I saw, and it was real. Space debris is everywhere. Thousands of objects orbit Earth. Dead satellites, discarded rocket stages, fragments from collisions, even paint flakes and pieces of insulation. Some of these objects are large and trackable. Others are tiny, invisible to radar, but still dangerous. Could one of these objects have caught the light in just the right way? Could it have tumbled at just the right angle to create the illusion of a face? Scientists have pointed out that prolonged exposure to microgravity can affect the brain in unexpected ways. Fluids shift upward, creating pressure behind the eyes. Visual processing can become distorted. Hallucinations are not uncommon among astronauts who spend extended periods in space. The brain depends on gravity to function normally. Blood flow changes in weightlessness. The inner ear, which controls balance, sends confusing signals. The eyes receive information that conflicts with what the brain expects. All of this can lead to disorientation, confusion, and yes, sometimes hallucinations. But there is one detail that Walker shared later, a detail that still gives people chills. He described the expression on the face. He said it was calm, almost peaceful. It was not angry or frightened. It was simply observing him, watching, as if it were studying him from across the void. That detail, more than any other, is what makes people uncomfortable. Because if it had been a frightening face, a threatening face, it would be easier to dismiss as a creation of fear. But this face was neutral, patient, curious. It reminded Walker of the way a scientist might observe a specimen under a microscope, interested but detached, curious but not emotional, as if the face, whatever it was learning about him the same way he tried to learn about it. And that, perhaps, is what makes this story so unsettling. Because outside that window, there was nothing. No light, no movement, no sound. Just the endless, absolute blackness of space. A blackness so deep and so complete that it swallows everything. In that darkness, there should be nothing. No faces, no eyes, no presence, just the cold, indifferent void. But for Charles Walker, On that quiet night in 1985, something was there. And yet, for one quiet moment, it looked back. The shuttle completed its mission without further incident. The crew conducted their experiments, deployed their satellites, and returned safely to Earth. Mission Control labelled it a success. The official reports made no mention of a face in the darkness. That detail never made it into the files. He returned to his work as an engineer. He continued designing experiments. He gave lectures at universities. He lived a normal life. But sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and dark, he would look up at the sky and wonder, is it still out there? Is it watching? And if so, why? We may never know. But the story serves as a reminder, a warning perhaps, that space is not as empty as we believe, that when we venture beyond our world, we enter a realm we do not understand, and sometimes, just sometimes, that realm notices us. Number 9. The human-like figure on the moon. But funding was drying up. The Vietnam War was expensive. Social programs needed money. The American public was losing interest in space exploration. Apollo 18, 19, and 20 were cancelled. Apollo 17 would be the last. The moon is a place of stillness. There is no wind to move the dust, no rain to shape the rocks. Everything stays exactly as it is, frozen in time, waiting in silence beneath the black sky. It is a world that feels abandoned, empty, dead. The moon is a museum of itself. Every impact, every event is preserved in the rock and dust. There is no weather to erode the craters, no wind to smooth the rough edges, no water to carve channels or dissolve minerals. The surface is exactly as it has been for billions of years. The sky above is always black. Always. Even in the middle of the lunar day, when the sun blazes down with unfiltered intensity, the sky remains black because there is no atmosphere to scatter the light. Stars are visible even in daylight, though the glare of the sun makes them difficult to see. It is a world of extremes. Temperatures swing from 120 degrees Celsius in sunlight to minus 150 degrees Celsius in shadow. There is no gentle twilight, no gradual transition between day and night, just harsh light and absolute darkness, separated by a sharp line. Step from sunlight into shadow on the moon, and you instantly feel the cold. Your suit's cooling system switches from trying to keep you cool to trying to keep you warm. The temperature change is instantaneous and extreme. It is like stepping from a desert at noon into a freezer. And yet, decades later, one photograph from that mission would spark questions that remain unanswered to this day. At first, the image looks like any other lunar photograph. Grey rocks scattered across the surface, the dark sky pressing down from above, long shadows stretching across the ground. Nothing unusual, nothing strange. But when you zoom in, when you look closely at the background, something appears. A shape, a figure. The photograph is labelled AS171372090. It was taken by Eugene Cernan during one of his excursions across the lunar surface. It was supposed to be a geological survey photo, documenting rock formations for later study, but in the background, barely visible, stands something that should not be there. It stands upright, casting a shadow behind it. It has what looks like a head, a torso, and limbs. The proportions are disturbingly familiar, human, or at least human-like. The image became known among researchers and enthusiasts as the Moon Man. The figure appears to be standing on a ridge in the distance, perfectly upright, perfectly still. Its shadow falls at the same angle as the shadows of nearby rocks, suggesting it is a solid, three-dimensional object. And yet, no astronaut reported seeing it. No mission log mentions it. No one spoke of it at all. This is perhaps the strangest part. The astronauts were there. They were on the surface. They took thousands of photographs. They explored for days. And yet, they never mentioned seeing a human-like figure standing in the distance. How could they have missed it? Or did they see it and choose not to report it? Eugene Cernan never mentioned this figure in his logs. In fact, none of the astronauts on Apollo 17 spoke about it at all. But years later, when NASA released thousands of archived images to the public, people began to notice. They zoomed in, they enhanced the photos, and they could not look away. The internet age brought new attention to old mysteries. Amateur researchers downloaded the high-resolution images and began examining them pixel by pixel. They adjusted contrast. They enhanced shadows. They looked for anything unusual. And in one photograph, frame after frame, they kept finding the same shape. Standing. Watching. Forums dedicated to space exploration buzzed with activity. Users shared their findings. They created enhanced versions of the image. They debated what it could be. Some were convinced it was proof of alien visitors. Others insisted it was just rocks. But no one could explain why the proportions were so perfect, why the shape looked so human. Our brains are wired to recognize human forms. It is how we survived as a species. We needed to quickly identify friends and foes, to spot another person in the distance, to recognize a human shape even in poor lighting or from far away. So our brains err on the side of caution. They see human figures everywhere, even when there are none. This is a well-documented psychological phenomenon. Show a group of people an abstract ink blot, and they will see faces, animals, and human figures in the random patterns. Show them a photograph of rocks on Mars, and some will see pyramids, statues, and faces. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, and the pattern they are best at recognizing is the human form. But that explanation did not satisfy everyone. Because the proportions of the figure are too precise, the shadow falls in exactly the right place. And there is something about the way it stands, perfectly upright, perfectly still, that feels intentional. If it is a rock formation, it is a remarkably human-shaped one. The head is the right size relative to the body. The arms appear to be at the sides. The legs are separated, as if the figure is standing in a relaxed pose. It looks less like a pile of random rocks and more like a statue, a marker, a sign. Geologists have pointed out that erosion on Earth can create human-shaped rock formations. Wind and water can carve stone into shapes that resemble people, but the Moon has no wind, no water, no erosion. So how could such a shape form naturally? Some have suggested it could be a balanced rock, a geological formation where one rock sits precariously on top of another, creating an upright shape. But balanced rocks are rare on the Moon, and they do not usually look this human, this specific. Other Apollo astronauts had reported strange experiences as well. Buzz Aldrin once spoke about hearing an unusual transmission during Apollo 11, a rhythmic beeping sound that did not come from NASA's communication system. It was unexplained, unexplainable, and it lingered in his memory for years. The transmission lasted for several minutes. It was not static. It was not random noise. It was a pattern, a rhythm, as if someone or something was sending a message. But when NASA analyzed the recordings, they found nothing. No source, no explanation. Aldrin described it in interviews years later. It was like Morse code, he said, but not any code I recognized. It had a pattern, a structure. It felt intentional, like someone was trying to communicate with us. There were also reports of flickering lights on the lunar horizon, lights that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Some astronauts described a feeling of being watched while they were on the surface, a presence, something observing them from the shadows. These reports were not officially recorded. They were mentioned casually, in passing, during debriefings or later interviews. The astronauts described them as fleeting impressions. Nothing concrete, nothing they could point to, just a feeling, but a persistent feeling nonetheless. One astronaut, whose name was never publicly released, described seeing a flash of light move across the sky while he was standing on the moon. It was not a meteor, it was not the Earth or a star. It was something else. Something that moved with purpose and then vanished. He watched it for several seconds. It was bright, brighter than the stars, and it moved in a straight line across the black sky. Then, without slowing or changing direction, it simply disappeared, not fading gradually, but vanishing instantly, as if it had passed through a door and closed it behind itself. What might be hidden in those places? What might exist in the eternal night of the permanently shadowed craters near the poles? What might be waiting in the vast, unexplored regions that no human eye has ever seen? The figure in the photograph has never been officially debunked. NASA says it is a pile of rocks. Others believe it might be something more, perhaps a remnant of something ancient, a marker left behind long before humans arrived, a sign that the moon, despite its silence, has not always been empty. Ancient astronaut theorists point to anomalies in lunar photographs, straight lines where there should be none, geometric shapes in places that should be random, reflections that do not match the surrounding terrain. Are these signs of past visitation? Or are they simply the result of our pattern-seeking brains finding meaning in randomness? Is it just rocks? Or is it something more? And if it is something more, what will it tell us? Will it be a relic of an ancient visit? A marker left by those who came before? Or will it be something we cannot yet imagine? Something that challenges our understanding of history, of intelligence, of what is possible? The moon waits, patient, silent, eternal, and its secrets remain safe in the shadows. Number 8. The Space Choir of Gemini 7. The Gemini program was NASA's bridge between Mercury and Apollo. Mercury had proven humans could survive in space, but the missions were short, just a few hours or at most a day. Apollo would require trips lasting over a week, so Gemini was created to test longer duration flights, to practice docking maneuvers, to learn how to conduct spacewalks. Gemini 7 was designed to test the absolute limits of human endurance in space. 2 weeks, 336 hours, 20,000 minutes. Could humans maintain their health and sanity for that long in such a confined space? Previous Gemini missions had tested short duration flights, a day, 2 days, 4 days. Each mission pushed a little farther, tested a little longer. But 2 weeks was unprecedented. 2 weeks in a space barely large enough for 2 men to sit side by side. 2 weeks breathing recycled air. 2 weeks with no privacy, no escape, no relief. The spacecraft was uncomfortable. The seats were hard. The temperature fluctuated. There was barely enough room to move. Personal hygiene was a challenge. Sleep was difficult. And the isolation was profound. Cut off from the world, floating in a tin can, with only each other for company. By the end of the mission, both men were exhausted. Their bodies ached. Their minds felt heavy. They were dizzy, disoriented, and more than ready to come home. But near the end of their journey, something happened that neither of them could explain. They had been in space for nearly 2 weeks. The days had blurred together into a monotonous routine. Monitor instruments, conduct experiments, eat, sleep, repeat. The excitement of the early days had faded. Now they just wanted to finish the mission and return home. It was during one of the long, quiet periods. The Earth turned slowly below them. The sun rose and set every 90 minutes, creating an endless cycle of light and darkness. The two men floated in their seats, monitoring instruments, conducting experiments, trying to stay occupied. This silence can drive people mad. The brain is not used to it. It searches for sounds, for stimulation, and when it finds none, it sometimes creates its own. Tinnitus is common among astronauts, ringing in the ears, a constant high-pitched tone that fills the silence. It started as a faint tone, a soft hum that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, they thought it might be interference, static from the radio, a glitch in the communication system. But the sound grew louder, it became clearer, and then it began to change. High-pitched frequencies emerged, rhythmic pulses echoed through their headsets, and beneath it all, something that almost resembled voices. Not words, not language, but something musical. Something haunting. It sounded like a choir. Borman and Lovell looked at each other, confusion clear even through the cramped confines of their helmets. They were both hearing it. This was not a hallucination. This was not one man's imagination. This was real, coming through both of their headsets simultaneously. Lovell reached up and adjusted his headset, thinking perhaps it was not properly connected. But the sound did not change. Borman did the same. Both men heard it clearly now. It was not in their imaginations. It was real, coming through their headsets, filling the tiny capsule with sound. The sound was unlike anything they had heard before. It was not mechanical. It was not the kind of noise you expect from a malfunction. It was musical, harmonious, beautiful, and it came from nowhere. Both men heard it. Both described it in the same way. A chorus of tones, layered and harmonious, echoing through the darkness of space. There was no source, no radio signal coming from Earth. No other spacecraft nearby. They were completely alone. Or were they? That was the question that haunted both men. If they were alone, where was the music coming from? If they were not alone, what was out there with them, singing in the darkness? They looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of confusion and wonder. What was this? Where was it coming from? Borman reached for the communication controls, ready to report it to Mission Control, but hesitated. How do you report something like this? How do you describe music from nowhere? This was not part of the mission plan. There was no protocol for hearing unexplained sounds. If they reported it, would Mission Control think they were losing their minds? Would it affect their careers? Would they be grounded from future missions? Back on Earth, NASA engineers scrambled to find an explanation. They checked for interference. They analyzed the radio frequencies. They looked for overlapping signals or static bursts. Nothing matched. The sounds continued for hours, sometimes gentle and melodic, other times sharp and discordant, like notes played out of tune. The engineers considered every possibility. Could it be radio signals from Earth, bouncing off the ionosphere in unexpected ways? Could it be interference from Soviet satellites? Could it be a malfunction in the Gemini spacecraft's communication system? But none of these explanations fit the pattern of what Borman and Lovell were hearing. They brought in radio experts. They consulted with physicists. They analysed recordings. They checked logs from other missions. Had anyone else heard these sounds? Were there any similar reports? But they found nothing. Gemini 7's experience was unique. The sounds were too complex, too structured. They rose and fell in waves. They harmonized. They created chords that no random interference could produce. It was music, deliberate music, but from where? The ionosphere can reflect radio waves in strange ways. Sometimes signals bounce around the planet multiple times before dissipating. Sometimes they are bent and distorted by magnetic fields. Could this create the illusion of music? Possibly. But the complexity of what Gemini 7 heard seemed to exceed what simple reflection could produce. Lovell later said it felt like being surrounded by music made by the stars themselves. He described it as beautiful and terrifying at the same time, because there was no reason for it, no explanation that made sense. And yet, it was there. Real, undeniable. Years after the mission, Lovell would speak about it in interviews. He would describe how the tones seemed to come in layers, like different voices in a choir, each one distinct, yet blending together into a single harmonious whole. He said it reminded him of Gregorian chants, those ancient religious songs sung by monks in cathedrals, their voices echoing off stone walls. Gregorian chants have a quality that is both earthly and otherworldly. The voices blend together in complex harmonies that seem to lift the spirit. They have been used for centuries to create a sense of connection to the divine, and that is what the space choir felt like to Lovell, a connection to something greater, something beyond human understanding. But there were no walls in space, no echoes, just the void, and yet the music echoed. Acoustics in space should not work. Sound needs a medium to travel through. Air, water, some substance whose molecules can vibrate and carry the wave. Space is a vacuum. There is no air. Sound should not exist there. And yet, these men heard music. Of course, the sound was coming through their headsets. It was being transmitted electronically. But where was the original source? What was generating these tones? What was creating this music? Some scientists believe the sounds could have been caused by electromagnetic waves vibrating through the spacecraft's systems. Plasma waves, they call them. Invisible currents of energy that flow through space, interacting with metal and wiring in ways we do not fully understand. But even this explanation feels incomplete, because the patterns were too regular, too intentional, almost as if something were composing them. Plasma waves do exist. They are created by charged particles moving through magnetic fields. The Earth's magnetosphere is full of them. Satellites have recorded these waves and converted them into sound that humans can hear. They sound eerie, haunting, like whispers from another world. NASA's Voyager spacecraft recorded sounds from various planets and moons. The radio emissions from Jupiter sound like whale songs. Saturn's rings create a haunting hum. Neptune produces tones that seem almost musical. Could Gemini 7 have been hearing something similar? Natural radio emissions from Earth's magnetosphere? But the sounds Gemini 7 heard were different. They were not just tones or frequencies. They were music. And music implies intention. It implies a composer, a source, something creating the patterns, shaping the harmonies, conducting the invisible orchestra. Music is organized sound. It has structure, rhythm, melody, harmony. Random noise does not create music. It takes intention, intelligence, purpose. So, if the space choir was music, who or what was making it? Similar sounds have been recorded by satellites and other astronauts over the years, but none of them completely explain what Gemini 7 captured. The timing, the rhythm, the way the tones seemed to respond to the silence around them. Apollo astronauts later reported hearing strange sounds during their missions. High-pitched whistles, low-frequency hums. bursts of noise that came and went without warning. Some described it as hearing the solar wind. Others said it felt like the universe itself was speaking to them in a language they could not understand. It is a haunting thought. Two men, floating hundreds of miles above the world, hearing what sounded like an invisible orchestra in the dark. They called it the space choir, and to this day, no one truly knows what it was. Perhaps it was plasma waves. Perhaps it was electromagnetic interference. Perhaps it was the spacecraft itself, resonating with energies from the sun and earth in ways we have yet to comprehend. Or perhaps it was something else. Something that sings in the darkness. Something that fills the void with music when no one is listening. If space really does sing, it might not be a metaphor. It could be the universe itself, vibrating with energy, a cosmic lullaby that no one truly understands. And maybe, just maybe, we are only beginning to hear it. Pythagoras believed in the music of the spheres. He thought that the planets and stars created harmonious tones as they moved through space. He believed the universe itself was musical, that mathematics and music were intrinsically linked, and that understanding one meant understanding the other. Modern science dismisses this as mysticism. We know that sound cannot travel through space. We know that planets do not create tones as they orbit. But perhaps Pythagoras was not entirely wrong. Perhaps the universe does have a music. Not sound as we understand it, but electromagnetic vibrations that permeate everything. And perhaps, under the right conditions, humans can hear it. Lovell flew to the moon on Apollo 8 and later commanded Apollo 13, but he never heard the space choir again. It remained a singular experience, a mystery, a reminder that space holds wonders we have barely begun to understand. The recordings from Gemini 7 still exist. They are archived at NASA headquarters. Researchers have analysed them countless times. They have filtered them, enhanced them, studied them from every angle, and still no definitive explanation has emerged. The space choir remains unexplained. Perhaps one day, with more advanced technology, we will understand what created those sounds. Or perhaps it will remain forever mysterious. One of those experiences that defies explanation, that reminds us how little we truly know about the universe we inhabit. Number 7. The glowing red light of Apollo 11. Apollo 11 was the culmination of years of work. Hundreds of thousands of people had contributed to making this mission possible. Engineers had designed rockets and spacecraft. Scientists had calculated trajectories. Astronauts had trained for every possible scenario. It was the most ambitious undertaking in human history. In that silence, your mind becomes hyper-aware. Every sound, every movement, every sensation is magnified. The astronauts learned to notice everything. A change in temperature, a slight vibration, an unusual smell. Any of these could indicate a problem. So they paid attention. They noticed. The crew dynamics were important. These 3 men would be confined together for over a week. They needed to work as a team. Armstrong was the commander, calm and focused. Aldrin was the lunar module pilot, brilliant and intense. Collins was the command module pilot, steady and reliable. Together, they represented the best humanity had to offer. But during the flight, both Armstrong and Aldrin noticed something unusual. In the distance, beyond their windows, there was a light. It was not a star. It was not sunlight reflecting off debris. It was something else. A steady, blinking object. Red, then white, then red again. And it seemed to be pacing their craft. The light appeared on the second day of the journey. Armstrong saw it first. He was looking out the window, admiring the view, when he noticed something moving in the distance. At first, he thought it might be a star. But stars do not move, and they do not blink. At first, they said nothing. They watched it quietly, exchanging glances, but staying silent on the radio. They knew what would happen if they reported it to Mission Control. UFO reports could risk their credibility. Worse, it could ground the mission. And they had not come this far to turn back now. The stakes were enormous. This was not just a mission. This was history. The eyes of the world were on them. Any hint of uncertainty, any suggestion of the unexplained, could be used by critics to question the entire space program. So they stayed silent, and they watched. So instead, they spoke in code. They asked Mission Control where the SIVB rocket booster was located. The SIVB was a large piece of their spacecraft that had separated earlier in the flight. If the light they were seeing was the booster, then there was nothing to worry about. It would simply be a part of their own ship, reflecting sunlight. The SIVB was large, about 60 feet long, and over 20 feet in diameter. If it was tumbling and catching sunlight, it could appear as a blinking light. This was a reasonable explanation. A safe explanation. One that did not involve anything unexplained. But Mission Control replied that the SIVB was thousands of miles away. It was not near them. It could not be what they were seeing. That meant whatever was out there, glowing in the darkness, was not part of their spacecraft. It was something else entirely. Armstrong and Aldrin exchanged a look. The light was still there, blinking steadily in the distance. It had been with them for nearly an hour now, maintaining a constant distance, moving at exactly their speed. That was not random. That was not debris tumbling through space. That was something keeping pace with them. Objects in space follow orbital mechanics. They obey the laws of physics. A piece of debris would not maintain a constant distance from a spacecraft. It would drift. It would follow its own trajectory. But this light stayed with them. It matched their speed. It maintained its distance. That implied control. That implied intent. The two astronauts stared at the object for several more minutes. It continued to blink. Red, white, red. It moved steadily, keeping pace with the Apollo module as if it were intentionally following them. And then, slowly, it began to fade. The light dimmed, and eventually it disappeared into the blackness. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, they would speak more freely. Aldrin described it as a cylinder-shaped object that seemed to pulse with light. He said it was steady, deliberate, not random. He described how the light seemed to emanate from within the object, not reflected from an external source. It glowed with its own energy, pulsing like a heartbeat. He said watching it felt like being observed, like whatever it was knew they were there and was curious about them. In his book, Aldrin wrote about the experience with careful words. He did not claim it was alien. He did not speculate wildly. He simply stated the facts. They saw a light. It moved with them. It disappeared. And they never found a satisfactory explanation. NASA eventually provided an explanation. They said it was sunlight reflecting off a detached panel from the spacecraft. A piece of metal tumbling slowly through space, catching the light at just the right angle to create the illusion of a glowing object. It was a reasonable explanation, logical, safe. Engineers demonstrated how a flat panel, spinning in space, could reflect sunlight in a rhythmic pattern. As it tumbled, one side would catch the sun and flash brightly, then rotate into shadow and disappear. From a distance, this could create the appearance of a blinking light. It was physics. Simple, explainable physics. NASA released diagrams showing how this could happen. They calculated tumble rates and reflection angles. They showed how a piece of thermal insulation or a panel from the service module could create exactly the effect the astronauts described. It was thorough, it was convincing, it was safe. But many people believe the explanation does not hold up, because the light appeared to move intelligently. It followed the module for several minutes before disappearing. It was not tumbling randomly. It was pacing them, watching them, and then, when it was ready, it left. A tumbling panel would not maintain a constant distance. It would drift, it would spin, its brightness would vary unpredictably as it rotated, but this light was steady, consistent. It blinked at regular intervals, it stayed with them, and then it chose to leave. The behavior was too precise, too controlled. Objects in space are subject to orbital mechanics. They follow predictable paths based on their velocity and the gravitational fields around them. But this object seemed to defy those rules. It maintained a position relative to Apollo 11. It matched their course, and then it departed on its own terms. In the silence of space, there is no room for tricks of the eye. There is no atmosphere to bend light or distort colours. What you see is what is there. And the thought that something unknown was flying beside humanity's first trip to the moon, that lingers, it stays with you. Maybe it was debris, maybe it was a detached panel, or maybe it was something else entirely, something that wanted to watch the moment when a species first reached beyond its own world, a witness to history, silent, patient, and then gone. What if Earth is being watched? What if our development is being monitored by intelligences we cannot comprehend? And what if, when we finally took our first steps beyond our world, they decided to observe more closely, to see if we were ready, to witness this pivotal moment in human history? Armstrong rarely spoke about it. When pressed, he would simply say that space is full of unexplained phenomena, that there is much we do not understand, and that perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. But Aldrin was more open. In later years, he would say that he believes there is life beyond Earth, that the universe is too vast for us to be alone, and that during that trip to the moon, he felt a presence, something watching, something aware. Aldrin has spent decades advocating for space exploration. He wants humans to go to Mars. He wants us to become a multi-planetary species, and he often speaks about the possibility of encountering other intelligences. He says, it is not a question of if, but when, and perhaps that is the truth. Perhaps humanity's first journey to another world did not go unnoticed. Perhaps something out there saw us leaving our cradle, taking our first steps into the cosmos, and decided to watch, to observe, to bear witness to the moment when a young species dared to dream of touching the stars. The light that followed Apollo 11 has never been explained to everyone's satisfaction. The official explanation remains unchanged, a detached panel, but the astronauts who were there, who saw it with their own eyes, who watched it pace them through the void, they know what they experienced. And they know it was something more than simple debris. Number 6. The mysterious knocking in space. China had joined an exclusive club. Only 2 other nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, had successfully sent humans into space. This was a moment of immense national pride. Yang Liwei was not just an astronaut, he was a symbol, a hero, the first of his people to leave the Earth and touch the edge of the cosmos. The launch had been perfect. The rocket lifted off smoothly, carrying Yang and his spacecraft into orbit. He performed his tasks with precision, conducting experiments, communicating with ground control, monitoring systems. Everything was going according to plan. This was a triumph for China, a demonstration of their technological prowess, a statement to the world that they were now a space-faring nation. Yang had excelled in his training. He was a fighter pilot before becoming an astronaut, accustomed to high-stress situations and split-second decisions. He was calm under pressure, logical, methodical. He was the perfect choice for this historic mission. In space, there is no sound, no air to carry vibrations. You cannot hear the engines of your spacecraft from outside. You cannot hear the sun burning. You cannot hear the planets orbiting or the stars exploding. It is silent, completely, utterly silent. And then Yang Liwei heard something that should not exist. A knock. A single, clear, metallic tap on the outside of his spacecraft. He stopped moving. He listened, and then he heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like someone was striking the hull of the spacecraft with a hammer. Slow, deliberate, rhythmic. Space debris is a serious concern for all missions. The International Space Station regularly performs maneuvers to avoid debris. Satellites are tracked carefully. When a collision is predicted, spacecraft must move. A piece of debris the size of a pebble traveling at orbital velocity carries the energy of a hand grenade. It can punch through metal. It can destroy systems. It can kill. But Yang's instruments showed nothing. No debris nearby, no objects on a collision course. The radar was clear. The tracking systems were silent. According to every sensor on the spacecraft, there was nothing out there. And yet, the knocking continued. There was no debris nearby. The instruments showed nothing. No objects, no movement, and there was no sign of anything outside the window. Yang floated there, listening, his pulse racing. The knock continued. Not random, not erratic, almost like a pattern, almost like a code. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, tap. The rhythm was too consistent to be random, too deliberate to be an accident. It felt intentional, as if something was trying to communicate. But what? And from where? Yang tried to identify the source. He floated to different parts of the cabin, listening carefully, trying to determine if the sound was louder in one area. He checked the hull. He examined the seals. He inspected every system, but he found nothing. Yang checked every system. Life support was normal, pressure was stable, temperature was fine. There were no alarms, no warnings, nothing to indicate any problem with the spacecraft. And yet, the knocking continued. He went through his checklist. Pressurization, normal. Life support, normal. Communications, normal. Power systems, normal. Guidance and navigation, normal. Everything was functioning perfectly. There was no rational explanation for the sound. He considered reporting it immediately to ground control. But what would he say? He was hearing knocking from outside the spacecraft? It sounded absurd. What if they thought he was losing his mind? What if they aborted the mission? This was China's first manned spaceflight. It had to be a success. Any problem, any hint of trouble, could be seen as a failure. When he returned to Earth, he immediately reported what he had heard. Chinese engineers took his account seriously. They wanted to understand, so they began to experiment. They hit every part of the Shenzhou spacecraft with tools, trying to recreate the sound Yang had described. They struck metal. They tested vibrations. They tried everything. They spent weeks trying to reproduce the sound. They used hammers, mallets, and various tools to strike the hull. They heated and cooled sections of the spacecraft to simulate thermal expansion. They subjected it to pressure changes. They tested every possible explanation, but nothing worked. The engineers were thorough. They documented every test. They recorded the sounds produced by each method. They compared them to Yang's description. Nothing matched. The knocking he heard was unique. specific, and it could not be recreated. But nothing matched. The material of the spacecraft simply did not produce that same tone. The knocking Yang heard was unique. It could not be replicated. The spacecraft's hull was made of aluminum alloy. It was relatively thin, designed to be light but strong. When struck, it should have produced a ringing sound, a metallic echo. But Yang described the knocking as dull, heavy, almost like wood. That did not match the material at all. Aluminum, when struck, has a characteristic sound. Bright, sharp, resonant. It rings. But the knocking Yang heard was nothing like that. It was deeper, heavier, more solid, as if the hull were made of something else entirely. What made the story even stranger was that other Chinese astronauts, on later missions, reported hearing the exact same sound. The knocking returned, always rhythmic, always deliberate, always unexplained. Yang Fei, who flew aboard Shenzhou 6 in 2005, heard it. Zhai Jigang, who performed China's first spacewalk in 2008, heard it. Every Chinese astronaut who has flown in space has reported the same mysterious knocking. It has become an expected part of Chinese space missions, a phenomenon they cannot explain but have learned to live with. When Yang Fei heard the knocking, he immediately recognized it from Yang Liwei's description. He knew what it was, or rather, he knew that no one knew what it was. He reported it calmly, matter-of-factly, as if it were just another aspect of spaceflight. The knocking has become part of Chinese astronaut training. New taikonauts are warned about it. You will hear knocking, instructors tell them. Do not be alarmed, it is normal. We do not know what causes it, but it happens on every mission. Note it in your log and continue with your tasks. NASA engineers, when they heard about the reports, suggested it might have been thermal expansion. In space, the metal hull of a spacecraft heats and cools rapidly as it moves in and out of sunlight. The metal expands and contracts. Sometimes, this can create sounds, creaks, groans, pops. This is a known phenomenon. Spacecraft make noise. The International Space Station is full of strange sounds. Astronauts report hearing bangs, creaks, and groans as the structure adjusts to temperature changes. It is normal, expected, part of life in space. The ISS orbits Earth every 90 minutes. That means it moves from sunlight to shadow and back again every 45 minutes. Each time it enters shadow, the temperature drops rapidly. Each time it enters sunlight, the temperature rises. The metal structure expands and contracts with these temperature changes, creating sounds. But Yang Liwei never agreed with that explanation. He said it was not a creak, it was not a groan, it was a knock, and it had intention. It felt purposeful, as if something or someone was trying to get his attention. He described the sound as coming from outside, not inside. It was not the spacecraft itself making noise. It was something striking the hull from the exterior. Something knocking, asking to be let in. Yang has given many interviews over the years. He always describes the knocking the same way. Deliberate, rhythmic, intentional. He says it felt like communication, like something was trying to reach him, and he wishes he could have responded. But how do you respond to a knock from the void? Imagine sitting completely alone, 200 miles above the Earth. There is no other human being within reach. You are suspended in the void, surrounded by nothing but darkness and stars. And then you hear it. Tap, tap, tap. Not inside the ship, outside. Something knocking on the hull. Something trying to reach you from the other side. What do you do? What do you think? Do you believe it is the ship itself, groaning under the stress of space? Or do you wonder if something else is out there, drifting just beyond your window, tapping gently on the metal, waiting for you to notice. The human mind in isolation is vulnerable. Astronauts report vivid dreams, strange thoughts, and heightened emotions. The combination of stress, isolation, and the strangeness of weightlessness can create unusual mental states. Could the knocking be a product of this? A shared hallucination experienced by every Chinese astronaut because they expect it? But shared hallucinations do not produce real sounds. They do not knock on the outside of spacecraft in patterns that can be recorded and analyzed. And Yang Liwei insists the sound was real, physical, something that could have been heard by anyone, not just by him. Yang looked out the window every time he heard the sound. He searched the darkness. He looked for movement, for light, for any sign of what might be causing it. But he saw nothing, just the black void and the distant stars. He pressed his face against the window, trying to see if there was anything clinging to the hull, any debris lodged in a joint or panel. But the angle was wrong. He could only see a small section of the spacecraft. The rest was hidden from view. Yang Liwei never found out. The knocking stopped eventually. But the memory stayed with him, and it has stayed with every astronaut who has heard it since. Because in the silence of space, a knock is not just a sound, it is a question. And the question is this: who is knocking? Some have suggested it might be micrometeorites, tiny particles of dust and rock, smaller than grains of sand, constantly bombarding spacecraft. But micrometeorites strike at tens of thousands of miles per hour. They do not knock, they impact, they create tiny craters. They do not produce rhythmic, deliberate sounds. Micrometeorite impacts are common. The ISS is hit thousands of times per day. But these impacts are random. They occur at unpredictable intervals. They vary in intensity. They do not follow patterns. And they certainly do not produce the kind of rhythmic knocking that Yang described. Others have proposed that it might be related to the spacecraft's thermal protection system, perhaps materials expanding and contracting in specific ways. But this explanation fails to account for why the sound is always the same, why every Chinese astronaut describes it identically, why it follows the same pattern. If it were thermal expansion, you would expect variation, different sounds at different times, some loud, some soft, some high-pitched, some low, but the knocking is always described the same way. Same rhythm, same tone, same feeling of intentionality. Chinese space officials have investigated extensively. They have consulted with Russian and American counterparts. They have reviewed every possible explanation, and they have found none that satisfies them. The knocking remains unexplained. Some researchers have suggested that the Shenzhou spacecraft has a unique design feature that creates this sound, perhaps something about its construction, its materials, or its configuration. But if that were true, why has no other spacecraft reported the same phenomenon? Why only Chinese missions? And perhaps that is the most unsettling part, that we have accepted this mystery, that we have grown accustomed to it, that somewhere in the darkness above, something knocks, and we do not know what it is, where it comes from, or what it wants. But it knocks, and it waits, and it never explains itself. The knocking continues on every Chinese space mission. It has become part of the routine, as expected as sunrise, as normal as breathing. The astronauts hear it, they note it in their logs, and they continue with their work. But late at night, when they are alone with their thoughts, floating in the darkness, they wonder, what is it? Why does it happen? What is trying to reach them from the void? And perhaps most importantly, what would happen if one day, instead of just knocking, it found a way inside? Due to length limitations, I'll continue in the next creation file. Number 5. The Tether Incident. In February of 1996, NASA launched an ambitious experiment aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia. The mission was called STS-75, and its goal was to test a new technology. A long tether made of copper wire that would stretch for miles into space. The idea was simple. As the tether moved through Earth's magnetic field, it would generate electricity, clean, renewable power from space itself. The concept was elegant. Earth is surrounded by a magnetic field, an invisible force that protects us from solar radiation and cosmic rays. This field extends far into space, and anything moving through it experiences an electrical current. By deploying a long conducting tether from a spacecraft, engineers theorized they could generate significant amounts of power. The theory behind this was sound. Michael Faraday discovered in the 1830s that moving a conductor through a magnetic field generates an electrical current. This is the principle behind every generator on Earth. Power plants work this way. Wind turbines work this way. The motion of the conductor relative to the magnetic field creates electricity. In space, a spacecraft orbits at tremendous speed. The International Space Station moves at 5 miles per second. A tether deployed from a spacecraft would cut through Earth's magnetic field lines at this velocity, generating a current along its length. The longer the tether, the more power it could produce. This power could be used for future space missions. It could extend the life of satellites. It could enable new types of experiments. It was a glimpse into a future where spacecraft could generate their own energy from the environment around them, rather than relying on solar panels or nuclear reactors. Imagine a space station that never runs out of power. Satellites that never need to be deorbited because their batteries died. Deep space probes that could generate electricity as they move through the magnetic fields of other planets. The possibilities were enormous. The experiment was called TSS-1R. TSS stood for Tethered Satellite System. It was a joint project between NASA and the Italian Space Agency. The satellite itself was Italian, a spherical device about 5 feet in diameter. It would be deployed from the shuttle on a tether and act as the far end of the electrical circuit. The experiment worked beautifully. The tether unfurled slowly, stretching out into the blackness, glowing faintly as electrical current flowed through it. The crew watched from the windows, mesmerized by the sight. It was a triumph of engineering, a glimpse into the future of space exploration. The deployment began smoothly. The tether reel worked perfectly. Inch by inch, foot by foot, mile by mile, the tether extended from the shuttle. The satellite moved farther away, climbing to a higher orbit, pulled by gravity and centrifugal force. And as it moved, current began to flow. The tether extended 12 miles from the shuttle. 12 miles of thin copper wire glowing softly against the darkness of space. It looked almost magical, a line of light stretching from the shuttle out into the void. The crew could see electrical discharges along its length, tiny sparks of plasma dancing along the wire as current flowed through it. For nearly 5 hours, the experiment performed perfectly. Data streamed back to Earth. Engineers celebrated. The power generation exceeded expectations. This was a success, a proof of concept, a demonstration that space itself could be harnessed to provide energy. The current generated was impressive, over 5,000 volts, half an amp. That might not sound like much, but for a proof of concept, it was tremendous. It showed that the theory worked, that this technology could be scaled up, that future tethers could be longer, thicker, and generate even more power. Scientists were already imagining the next steps. A tether twice as long, orbital power stations, tethers that could provide propulsion as well as power, using the magnetic field not just to generate electricity, but to change orbit without burning fuel. The possibilities seemed endless. And then, without warning, the tether snapped. It broke free from the shuttle and drifted away into the void, tumbling end over end, disappearing into the darkness. The crew was disappointed. The experiment had failed. But they kept the cameras rolling, recording the loose tether as it floated farther and farther away. The break was sudden. One moment, the tether was taut, glowing, functioning perfectly. The next, it was gone. Alarms sounded in the cabin. The crew rushed to the windows. They saw the tether drifting away, spinning slowly, its broken end trailing behind it like a wounded snake. Later analysis would show that the tether had broken due to an electrical overload. The current generated was stronger than anticipated, and it arced through the insulation, creating a plasma discharge that severed the wire. It was a failure, but a valuable one. They had learned something important. The tether was insulated, but the insulation was not perfect. At one point along its length, the insulation had become damaged, perhaps by a micrometeorite impact, perhaps by the harsh environment of space. Whatever the cause, the copper wire became exposed, and when 5,000 volts found a path to the plasma around the tether, it arced. The arc was like lightning, intense, instantaneous. The temperature at the arc point exceeded thousands of degrees. The copper wire vaporized, the tether snapped, and 12 miles of conducting wire began to drift away into space, still carrying a charge, still glowing, still surrounded by plasma. And that is when something strange appeared. At first, it looked like dust, tiny specks drifting across the camera's view. But then more appeared, dozens of them, glowing, circular shapes, semi-transparent and shimmering. They pulsed with light, as if they were alive, and they moved, not randomly, not chaotically, but deliberately, as if they had purpose. The crew noticed them immediately. "What is that?" one astronaut said. "Are those particles?" Another leaned closer to the window. "They are glowing." "Why are they glowing?" Soon, there were hundreds. They glided across the screen in different directions, some spinning slowly, others moving in curves and arcs. It looked like they were floating in a current that no one could see, an invisible river of energy, carrying them through the darkness. The objects varied in size. Some were small, barely visible. Others were large, several feet across. They all had the same basic shape, circular, disc-like, with a dark center and a glowing rim. They looked remarkably similar to each other, as if they were all the same type of object. The crew watched in amazement. What were these things? Where had they come from? The objects seemed to be attracted to the tether, gathering around it, swirling in complex patterns. Some appeared to pass behind the tether. Others moved in front of it. They varied in size, some small and dim, others large and bright. "They are all around it," one crew member observed. "Look at the density. There must be hundreds of them." Another voice, awed and confused. "Where did they all come from?" The movement was coordinated, not random. The objects moved as if they were part of a group, a school of fish, a flock of birds. They maintained spacing, they moved together, and they all seemed focused on the tether. NASA, when they reviewed the footage, said the objects were ice particles, tiny flakes of frozen water, reflecting sunlight, drifting near the camera lens. It was a reasonable explanation. Ice forms on spacecraft all the time, and when it breaks free, it floats away, catching the light. Spacecraft release water vapor as a byproduct of life support systems. This vapor freezes instantly in the vacuum of space, creating tiny ice crystals that drift near the spacecraft. When illuminated by sunlight, these crystals can appear bright, almost luminous. This is a known phenomenon. The shuttle's water dump creates clouds of ice particles. When wastewater is expelled, it freezes immediately, creating thousands of tiny crystals that catch the sunlight. From a distance, these can look like glowing orbs. This is NASA's official explanation for what the crew saw. But when scientists analyzed the footage more closely, they noticed something that did not fit. Many of the glowing objects appeared to pass behind the tether. The tether was 12 miles long. If the objects were passing behind it, that meant they were enormous, and they were far away. Not tiny flakes near the camera, something much, much larger. The perspective was clear. The tether was in the distance, visible as a thin line across the screen. And these objects moved across the screen, some in front of the tether, some behind it. For an object to pass behind a 12-mile-long tether, it would have to be miles across itself. These were not ice particles. These were massive objects. Researchers calculated the size based on the perspective. If the objects were truly passing behind the tether at a distance of 12 miles, they would have to be several miles in diameter. Enormous. Far too large to be ice crystals or water droplets. These would be objects of significant size and mass, and their movement did not match simple physics. Some of the objects seemed to spin in place, others changed speed. A few appeared to hover, as if they were observing the tether, studying it. The footage showed patterns, coordination, intention. Ice particles would move randomly. They would be affected by the shuttle's motion, by the tether's wake, by solar wind. But these objects moved independently. They changed direction. They accelerated and decelerated. They moved as if they were under some form of control. This led to wild theories. Some people believed the objects were space debris interacting with the tether's electrical field. The static electricity, they said, could have attracted particles and made them glow. Others suggested something far stranger. What if these were not objects at all? What if they were alive, plasma-based life forms? Creatures made of energy, living in the magnetic fields of planets, invisible to us, until moments like this. The idea of plasma-based life is not as far-fetched as it sounds. Plasma is the fourth state of matter, after solid, liquid, and gas. It is ionized gas, where electrons have been stripped from atoms, creating a soup of charged particles. 99% of the visible universe is plasma. Stars are plasma. Nebulae are plasma. The space between planets is filled with plasma, and plasma can organize itself into complex structures. Scientists have observed plasma forming filaments, vortices, and even cellular patterns under certain conditions. Could it be possible that life, as we understand it, might exist not in organic form but as organized patterns of plasma? Energy beings, invisible to us, living in the electromagnetic fields around planets and stars? In the 1990s, scientists conducted experiments with plasma in laboratory conditions. They found that under certain circumstances, plasma forms spherical structures that behave remarkably like living cells. They maintain boundaries. They reproduce by dividing. They respond to external stimuli. They exhibit behavior that, in organic matter, we would call life. These plasma spheres were called plasmoids, and they raised intriguing questions. If plasma can organize itself into cell-like structures in a laboratory, what might it do in the vast reaches of space, where magnetic fields are stronger, where energy is more abundant, where there are no constraints? Could the universe be filled with plasma life? Beings made of pure energy, floating through the magnetospheres of planets, invisible to our eyes, undetectable by our instruments, except in rare moments when conditions are just right. NASA dismissed all of it. They said it was an optical illusion, a trick of the camera, nothing more. But the footage is still available online, and once you see it, it is hard to unsee. Because the scene does not look like ice floating in space. It looks like a swarm. It looks coordinated. It looks alive. One astronaut on the mission described the view as looking out into an ocean full of life. And maybe that is exactly what it was. A brief, haunting glimpse of something that was not supposed to be there. Something we do not yet have the words to describe. Something that exists in the spaces between worlds, waiting in the dark, glowing softly, just out of reach. The crew member who made that observation was a veteran of multiple shuttle flights. He had seen his share of unusual things in space, but this was different. This felt different. He said later that it changed his perspective on what space might contain. "I always thought space was empty," he said in an interview years later. "Vacuum, nothing." But looking at that footage, I realized that maybe we are wrong. Maybe space is full of things we cannot see, cannot measure, cannot understand, and maybe, just maybe, we got a glimpse of it that day. The tether experiment was never repeated. NASA moved on to other projects. But the footage remains. Hundreds of glowing objects moving through space, swirling around a broken tether, pulsing with light. And no one can definitively say what they were. And maybe that is the real mystery. Not what these objects were, but what it means if they were alive. What it means if we share this universe with beings so different from us that we cannot even recognize them as life. What it means if, all this time, we have been surrounded by intelligence, by consciousness, by presence, and we simply lacked the eyes to see it. The footage from STS-75 has been analysed by researchers around the world. Some see evidence of something extraordinary. Others see only ice and optical illusions. The debate continues. But one thing is certain. Something appeared on that footage. Something moved in patterns. Something glowed in the darkness around that broken tether. And whether it was ice or life or something in between, it reminds us that space still holds mysteries. That despite all our technology, all our knowledge, all our exploration, we are still just beginning to understand the universe we inhabit. Number 4. The Space Angels of Salyut 7. Of all the strange events reported in orbit, this one might be the most surreal, the most otherworldly, the most impossible to explain. It happened in July of 1984, aboard the Soviet space station Salyut 7. 6 cosmonauts were living and working inside the station, conducting experiments and repairs. They had been in space for weeks, and they were exhausted. Living on a space station is demanding work. The days are long. The tasks are complex. Everything takes longer in weightlessness. Simple tasks that would take minutes on Earth can take hours in space. You fight against your own body, which wants to float away. You fight against tools that drift. You fight against exhaustion. Salyut 7 had experienced significant problems, power failures, attitude control issues. The station had even been unoccupied for months before this crew arrived to repair it. The cosmonauts were heroes, sent to save a dying station, working around the clock to bring systems back online. The pressure was immense. If they failed, the station would be lost. Years of work and billions of rubles would be wasted. The Soviet space program would be embarrassed on the world stage. So they pushed themselves. They worked past the point of exhaustion. They refused to give up. Then, without warning, the entire station filled with light. A blinding orange glow poured through the windows, flooding the cabin. The cosmonauts shielded their eyes, confused and alarmed. What was happening? Was something on fire? Had the sun flared? They rushed to the windows, trying to understand the source of the light. The light was unlike anything they had experienced. It was not the harsh white light of the sun. It was warm, soft, orange, and golden. It filled the cabin completely, eliminating all shadows. Everything glowed with this strange, beautiful light. And that is when they saw them. 7 enormous figures, floating just outside the station. Each one looked human, but luminous, radiant, glowing with soft, golden light. And they had wings. Not small wings, not symbolic wings, but massive, sweeping wings that stretched for miles across the blackness of space. The figures were larger than anything the cosmonauts had ever seen. Each one was easily the size of a commercial airliner, maybe larger. Their wings extended so far that they disappeared into the distance, fading into the darkness. And yet, despite their size, they appeared delicate, ethereal, as if they were made not of matter but of pure light. The proportions were perfect, the faces were serene. The wings moved slowly, gracefully, as if the figures were swimming through the void. They did not flap their wings. They did not need to. They simply floated, suspended in space, surrounded by golden light. The cosmonauts stared in disbelief. They called to each other, confirming what they were seeing. All 6 of them saw the same thing. The figures floated alongside the station, moving gently, peacefully. Their faces were calm, smiling. They radiated warmth, comfort, a sense of deep, profound peace. One cosmonaut later described the faces as impossibly beautiful. He said they looked human, but perfected, as if they were what humans might become after thousands of years of evolution, or perhaps what humans looked like before the fall, before pain and suffering and fear entered the world. The eyes of the figures were especially striking, large, luminous, filled with what the cosmonauts described as infinite compassion. Looking into those eyes, one cosmonaut said, was like looking into the heart of the universe itself, like being seen and known and loved on a level beyond comprehension. For a long time, no one spoke. They simply floated there, trying to process what they had seen, trying to make sense of it. One finally broke the silence, asking the others if they had seen what he had seen. They all nodded. Yes, they had all seen the angels. When they returned to Earth, Soviet officials immediately classified the report. They labeled it as psychological stress, hallucinations caused by fatigue and isolation. The cosmonauts were told not to speak about it, not to write about it, not to share it with anyone. It was a state secret. The Soviet Union was materialist, atheist. There was no room for angels in their worldview. The very idea was dangerous. It suggested spirituality. It suggested things beyond human understanding. It suggested that perhaps the official doctrine was wrong, and so the report was buried, hidden away in classified files. The KGB interviewed each cosmonaut separately. They asked detailed questions. They looked for inconsistencies. They tried to find evidence that the men had colluded to create a false story. But the accounts matched perfectly. Every detail, every description. The 6 men had seen the same thing. Doctors examined the cosmonauts. They tested for neurological problems. They checked for signs of mental illness. They found nothing. The men were healthy, sane, and adamant about what they had witnessed. But years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the men began to talk, and they all said the same thing. What they saw was real. It was not a hallucination. It was not stress. It was not their imaginations. They saw it. All 6 of them. Together, they spoke in interviews, they wrote memoirs, they appeared at conferences, and their stories never changed. They never contradicted each other. They always described the same thing. 7 luminous figures with wings, floating in space, radiating peace. One of the cosmonauts became deeply religious after the experience. He joined the Orthodox Church. He said that seeing the angels confirmed everything he had secretly believed but had been afraid to admit in the Soviet Union. He said they were messengers, guardians, proof that there is more to existence than the material world. Skeptics have tried to explain the event. Some say it was sunlight reflecting off ice crystals, creating a halo effect around the station. Others believe it was a shared hallucination, caused by oxygen deprivation or prolonged exposure to microgravity. The human brain, they say, can create vivid images when it is deprived of sensory input for too long. Group hallucinations are rare, but not impossible. Under extreme stress, shared trauma, or environmental factors, multiple people can sometimes experience similar visions. It is a documented psychological phenomenon, and space certainly creates extreme conditions. Isolation, weightlessness, constant exposure to cosmic radiation. These factors can affect the brain in unpredictable ways, but the cosmonauts never wavered. One of them later said, "They were not threatening, they were not frightening, they were welcoming. They felt like guardians, like they were watching over us, protecting us." He described the feeling of peace that washed over him when he saw them. He said all the stress, all the fatigue, all the worry disappeared in that moment. He felt safe, loved, as if everything was going to be all right, as if, no matter what happened, he was not alone. "I have never felt anything like it before or since," he said. It was as if all the love in the universe was concentrated in that moment, as if those beings were made of love itself, and they were giving it to us, freely, unconditionally. Whatever they saw that day, one thing is certain. No human has ever looked out into the vast, endless dark of space and seen something like that again. The angels of Salyut 7 appeared once, and then they were gone. An American astronaut, speaking off the record, described seeing a golden light outside the International Space Station during a spacewalk. He said it appeared suddenly, hovering in the distance, and then vanished. He never reported it officially. He did not want to be ridiculed. But he wonders if it was related to what the Salyut 7 crew saw. Maybe they were hallucinations. Maybe they were a trick of the light. Or maybe, just maybe, they were something else. Something we do not yet understand. Something that watches over us from the edges of the void. Maybe the angels of space show themselves only when we are far enough from home to truly need them. When we are at our most exhausted, our most vulnerable, our most alone, perhaps that is when they appear. Not to frighten us, not to warn us, but to remind us that even in the coldest, darkest, most hostile environment imaginable, we are not alone. We are seen, we are known, we are loved. And perhaps that is what angels are. Not beings from religious texts or ancient mythology, but something older, something deeper, something that exists beyond our understanding, watching over all life, all consciousness, all beings brave enough to venture into the infinite unknown. The cosmonauts who saw the angels are older now. Some have passed away, but those who remain still speak of that day with reverence, with wonder. They say it changed them. It gave them perspective on what is truly important. It reminded them that there is more to existence than what we can see and measure and understand. Number 3. The phantom lights of Apollo 11. He closed his eyes again. And again, a flash, this time blue. It was startling, like someone had taken a photograph with a flash camera inches from his face. But there was no camera, no light source, just the flash appearing from nowhere. Armstrong's first thought was that something was wrong with his eyes. He had undergone extensive medical testing before the mission. His vision was perfect. But now, suddenly, he was seeing lights that were not there. Was this the beginning of some serious medical problem? He tried to ignore it. He needed sleep. The mission was demanding, and rest was crucial. But every few minutes, another flash, sometimes white, sometimes blue. Occasionally, a streak of yellow or golden light that seemed to draw a line across his vision. The astronauts joked about it over the radio, but deep down it worried them. No one knew if it was dangerous. They were traveling through deep space, exposed to radiation levels unlike anything they had experienced before. Were their brains being damaged? Were their eyes failing? Was this a sign of something catastrophic? Mission Control took their reports seriously. They consulted with doctors, physicists, and radiation specialists. The consensus was troubling. The flashes were probably real, and they were probably caused by radiation, but the exact mechanism was unknown, and the long-term effects were uncertain. The doctors had theories. They knew that space was filled with high-energy particles. They knew that these particles could interact with human tissue, but no one had ever spent 3 days traveling through deep space before. Apollo was unprecedented, and so were the flashes. NASA eventually confirmed that it was not a hallucination. It was real. The lights were real, and they were caused by something invisible, cosmic rays. High-energy particles, traveling at nearly the speed of light, slamming through space and into their optic nerves. The flashes they saw were their brains reacting to these invisible bullets from deep space. Cosmic rays are everywhere. They stream through the universe constantly, born in the hearts of dying stars and the explosions of supernovae. On Earth, we are protected. The atmosphere shields us. The magnetic field deflects them, but in space, there is no protection. The particles hit you directly. They pass through your body, through your bones, through your brain. A single cosmic ray carries enormous energy. When it strikes a cell, it can tear through DNA, damaging the genetic code. When it strikes nerve tissue, it can trigger a signal, creating a false sensation. When it strikes the optic nerve, the brain interprets it as light. A flash, a spark, a reminder that you are being constantly bombarded by the universe itself. The energy of a single cosmic ray can be astounding. Some particles carry as much energy as a well-thrown baseball concentrated into a space smaller than an atom. When these particles strike human tissue, they leave a trail of ionization and damage in their wake. On Earth, cosmic rays are filtered by the atmosphere. The particles collide with air molecules, creating showers of secondary particles that are much less energetic. By the time these particles reach the ground, they are relatively harmless. But in space, there is no atmosphere. The cosmic rays hit with their full energy. Other astronauts reported seeing the lights too. Some described them as lightning from inside their skulls. One astronaut said it was like seeing stars painted across the darkness behind his eyes. Another said the flashes were so bright they woke him from sleep. Apollo astronauts on later missions saw them too. They gave them names. Some called them cosmic snowflakes because they appeared as small, brief points of light. Others called them meteors of the mind because they streaked across their vision like shooting stars. Everyone saw them. Everyone wondered what they meant. The flashes became an expected part of lunar missions. Pre-flight briefings included warnings about them. Astronauts were told not to be alarmed. The flashes were normal, unavoidable. part of the experience of traveling beyond Earth's protective cocoon, but knowing they were normal did not make them less unsettling, especially at night, trying to sleep, when you would close your eyes and be greeted by a light show you could not control. Flash, 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 a constant reminder that you are being bombarded by particles from the depths of space. Long-term exposure to cosmic rays is one of the greatest challenges to deep space exploration. A trip to Mars would take months. The astronauts would be exposed to these particles constantly, with no protection. By the time they arrived, their bodies would have absorbed doses of radiation far beyond what is considered safe. Cancer risks would increase. Cognitive function might decline. Their DNA would be scarred by thousands of particle impacts. NASA has done extensive studies on cosmic radiation. They have calculated exposure levels for various missions. They have looked for ways to shield astronauts, but there is no easy solution. The particles are too energetic. They pass through meters of rock. A thin spacecraft hull offers almost no protection. Some proposals involve surrounding the spacecraft with water tanks, which would absorb some of the radiation. Others suggest using strong magnetic fields to deflect the particles, mimicking Earth's natural protection. But these solutions are expensive, heavy, and technologically challenging. But for those few days, traveling between Earth and the Moon, they saw the universe in a way most people never will. They saw the invisible made visible. They felt the weight of deep space pressing against their minds. And they learned that even in the darkness, space is never truly empty. And yet, the astronauts accepted this. They knew the risks. They understood that leaving Earth meant leaving behind the protections that have allowed life to flourish on our planet. They went anyway, because some questions are worth the risk. Some dreams are worth the danger. And some mysteries can only be solved by those brave enough to face the darkness and see what lies beyond. Years later, researchers studied the effects of cosmic radiation on the Apollo astronauts. They looked for increased cancer rates, cognitive decline, cataracts, and other health problems. The findings were mixed. Some astronauts developed health issues that might be related to radiation exposure. Others lived long, healthy lives. The sample size was small. Only 24 men traveled to the Moon, and they were exposed to cosmic radiation for only a few days. What would happen on a longer mission? What would happen on a trip to Mars, where the exposure would last months? These are questions we still cannot fully answer. We know cosmic radiation is dangerous. We know it causes the light flashes. We know it damages DNA. But we do not know exactly how much exposure is too much. We do not know the long-term consequences. We are still learning. The phantom lights of Apollo remain a mystery in some ways. We understand the basic mechanism: cosmic rays, optic nerves, false signals. But there is still much we do not know. Why do some flashes appear as points and others as streaks? Why do the colors vary? What determines the frequency and intensity? Perhaps one day, with more advanced technology and more astronauts traveling through deep space, we will fully understand this phenomenon. Or perhaps it will remain one of those experiences that defines space travel. A reminder that out there, beyond Earth's protection, the universe touches you directly, and you see it with your own eyes, even when they are closed. Number 2. The Space Choir Incident. In 1984, a team of Soviet cosmonauts aboard the Salyut 7 space station began hearing something impossible. It started faintly, a soft, melodic sound echoing through the metal hull of the station. At first, they thought it was static, or maybe a malfunctioning radio. But as they listened more closely, they realized it was something else. It sounded like singing. It was not mechanical noise. It was not random tones or frequencies. It was a harmony. Deep voices layered together, resonating through the walls of the station. Calm, haunting, strangely peaceful. The sound filled the cabin for several minutes before fading away, leaving the crew staring at each other in disbelief. The first cosmonaut to hear it thought he was dreaming. He had been conducting an experiment, monitoring instruments, when the sound began. At first, it was so faint he thought it might be his imagination, but it grew louder, clearer. And he realized it was not coming from his headphones. It was coming from the station itself. He removed his headphones to confirm. The sound continued. It was in the air, in the walls, everywhere. A chorus of deep voices, singing in harmony. He called to his crewmates. They stopped what they were doing and listened, and they heard it too, all of them. A chorus of deep, resonant voices singing in perfect harmony. The sound seemed to come from the walls, from the air, from everywhere and nowhere at once. The harmonies were complex, multiple voices, each distinct but blending perfectly. Major chords, minor chords, shifts in tone and tempo. It was not random, it was music, composed, performed, beautiful. Mission Control, when they heard about it, dismissed it immediately. They said it was interference from radio waves bouncing off the ionosphere, a natural phenomenon, nothing unusual. But the cosmonauts were certain that the music had come from inside the station, not from outside, not from the radio. It was as if the station itself was singing, and then, a few days later, it happened again. The sound returned, louder this time, clearer. The harmonies were more distinct, the voices more defined. And this time, it felt like the music was answering them, responding to their presence. This interaction disturbed him more than anything, because it suggested intelligence. It suggested that whatever was creating the music was aware of him, was responding to him, was, in some sense, communicating with him. One cosmonaut later described it as the most beautiful and terrifying sound he had ever heard. An American astronaut, who requested anonymity, described hearing what sounded like a distant choir during a spacewalk. He said the sound seemed to come through his suit, through his bones, as if it were vibrating through his entire body. When he mentioned it over the radio, his crewmate admitted hearing the same thing. They never reported it officially. They did not want to seem unstable. This suggests that the phenomenon is not limited to Soviet spacecraft. It is not specific to Salyut 7. It happens across different vehicles, different crews, different nationalities, which means it is either a universal property of being in space or something that exists in space itself. But the men who were there insist it was not in their heads. It was not an illusion. It was real. One said, "It felt like someone was out there, singing to us. Not threatening, not frightening, just singing." And maybe that is the point. Maybe space is not as silent as we think. Maybe it hums with frequencies we cannot hear. Maybe it vibrates with music that only reveals itself to those who are far enough from home to truly listen. Ancient cultures believed in the music of the spheres. They thought the cosmos was fundamentally musical, that mathematics and harmony were the foundation of reality. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the universe does sing. And perhaps, when we venture into space, we finally get to hear the song. Number 1. The glowing jellyfish UFO. In 1985, astronaut Jake Garn was aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery when something outside caught his eye. Something that should not have been there. Something glowing, drifting, and eerily alive. It was not a star. It was not debris. It was not sunlight reflecting off ice or metal. It was something else entirely. It looked like a giant jellyfish made of pure light. Its body was translucent, shimmering softly in the blackness. It pulsed, expanding and contracting, as if it were breathing. Garn had been an astronaut for years. He had seen countless strange things in space, unusual cloud formations on Earth, strange colours in the atmosphere, unexpected lights and shadows. But he had never seen anything like this. It defied description. It defied logic. The object was beautiful. That was his first thought. Not threatening, not frightening. Beautiful. It glowed with an inner light, soft and welcoming. It moved gracefully, elegantly, like a jellyfish swimming through an ocean. But the ocean was the void of space. The colour shifted slowly, from a deep ocean blue to a warm, glowing green. Then back again. It floated just beyond the shuttle, moving gently through the void. The crew gathered at the window, speechless. They tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Maybe it was exhaust gas, they thought. Frozen particles from the shuttle's engines, illuminated by sunlight. But it did not behave like gas. It did not disperse. It did not fade. Gas would expand, diffuse, and disappear quickly in the vacuum of space. But this object maintained its shape, its structure. It held together, as if it had some internal cohesion, as if it were more than just random particles floating in the void. It moved deliberately, as if it had a mind of its own. It paced the shuttle for several minutes, gliding alongside them, keeping perfect distance. And then, slowly, it began to fade. The glow dimmed, the shape dissolved, and it disappeared into the blackness, leaving the crew standing at the window, staring into the empty void. One crew member tried to photograph it. He grabbed a camera and pointed it toward the window, but by the time he got the shot, it was already fading. The photograph shows only a faint blur of light against the darkness. Not enough to analyze, not enough to study, just enough to prove that something had been there. Back on Earth, NASA analysts labeled it an ionized gas cloud. They said it was the result of particles released by the shuttle's engines, charged by solar radiation and magnetic fields. It was a tidy explanation, scientific, logical, safe, except for one thing: the phenomenon kept happening. Astronauts on later missions described similar glowing orbs. Some said they appeared to watch from a distance, hovering silently, just out of reach. Even Soviet cosmonauts reported seeing plasma entities that followed their crafts for miles, glowing softly in the darkness. A cosmonaut from the Mir space station described seeing 3 glowing spheres that appeared outside his window during a nighttime pass over the Pacific Ocean. He said they moved in formation, maintaining perfect spacing, as if they were connected by invisible threads. They paced the station for nearly 15 minutes before rising up and disappearing into the darkness above. Some scientists now believe these sightings could be caused by charged particles interacting with the magnetic fields around spacecraft. Natural phenomena. Explainable. But others, especially those who have actually seen it, say it felt too intentional, too deliberate. One veteran astronaut said, "It felt like being studied, like something was observing us, curious about what we were doing out there. Maybe it really was plasma. Maybe it was gas and particles and magnetic fields, all combining to create something that looked alive. Or maybe something out there is curious about us. Maybe it floats close enough to be seen, yet remains too strange to ever be understood." Either way, the image of a glowing, breathing light, silently keeping pace with a human shuttle, is haunting. It stays with you. Because in space, when something stares back at you, there is nowhere to run. There is no escape. You are suspended in the void, surrounded by infinity. And if something out there wants to watch you, it can, for as long as it wants, until it decides to fade away into the darkness. And then you are alone again, floating in silence, wondering if it was ever really there at all. Jake Garn later said that seeing the glowing jellyfish changed his perspective on space exploration. He realized that we are not just exploring empty void, we are venturing into an environment we do not understand, an environment that may be full of phenomena we cannot explain, things that exist beyond our current understanding of physics and biology. Perhaps space is not the sterile, empty void we imagine. Perhaps it is teeming with forms of existence we cannot recognize, energy beings, plasma life, entities that exist in dimensions we cannot perceive, things that watch us from just beyond our ability to see. And maybe that is the greatest mystery of all, not whether we are alone in the universe, but whether we have the ability to recognize life when we see it, whether our definitions are too narrow, our perceptions too limited, our understanding too human. The glowing jellyfish is still out there, or others like it, drifting through the magnetic fields around Earth, pulsing with light, breathing in ways we cannot comprehend, watching, waiting, and perhaps wondering about us, just as we wonder about them. Thank you for watching, and for staying with us until the end. We have plenty more videos coming in the future, more stories from the edge of space, more mysteries waiting to be told. If you enjoyed this journey, please hit that subscribe button so you do not miss them. These stories remind us that space is not just a destination, it is a frontier, a boundary between what we know and what we have yet to discover. Every astronaut who ventures beyond Earth becomes an explorer of the unknown, and sometimes the unknown looks back. We have shared 10 stories tonight. 10 moments when astronauts encountered things they could not explain, things that defied logic, things that challenged their understanding of reality. These stories come from trained observers, rational people, scientists and engineers who dedicated their lives to understanding the universe through evidence and reason, and yet they saw things that cannot be easily explained, things that persist in memory, things that haunt, things that whisper of possibilities we have barely begun to consider. Are these stories proof of something extraordinary? Or are they simply reminders of how little we understand about the universe we inhabit? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Perhaps the truth is something we have not yet imagined. What might exist in those vast distances? What forms of life might have evolved under conditions we cannot imagine? What intelligences might be watching the cosmos as we watch it, wondering if they are alone? Perhaps the encounters our astronauts have experienced are glimpses of that larger universe. Perhaps space is not empty, but teeming with life, with consciousness, with presences we cannot yet detect. Perhaps we are surrounded by wonders, and we are only just beginning to see them. Until next time, good night. May your dreams be filled with stars and mysteries. May you find peace in the darkness, and may you never stop wondering what lies beyond the edge of the known. Sleep well. The universe is waiting.